Some folks say a house becomes a home when love walks through the door, but Thatcher Cole had forgotten what either one felt like. For 3 years, his heart had been as empty as the rooms in his half-finished house, echoing with memories of what used to be. When Eleanor Finch showed up at his ranch, with nothing but a schoolteacher's pride and a trunk full of books, Thatch offered her the barn. It seemed like the decent thing to do, but Eleanor had other plans. She looked at his lonely house and saw something he couldn't place, where two broken people might just find their way back to wholeness. What started as simple charity became something neither expected. Could a woman who'd lost everything teach a grieving cowboy that home isn't about the walls you build, but about the person you choose to build them with? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun hung low over Dustvale, Texas, casting long shadows across a town that had seen better days. Once, this place had thrived with the promise of the frontier cattle drives rolling through, merchants setting up shop, families building dreams on the endless horizon. Now, with the railroad passing 20 miles north and the silver mine played out, Dustvale clung to existence like a stubborn weed in drought-cracked earth. Thatcher Cole stood 6'7" in his weathered boots, watching the sunrise from his porch with the same ritual he'd performed every morning for the past 3 years. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, but he didn't notice. Time had a way of slipping past him these days, unmarked and unobserved. The empty rocking chair beside him creaked in the morning brazier sound that once would have made him smile, now just another reminder of what was gone. His ranch sprawled across 500 acres of decent grazing land, with a creek that ran year-round and soil that could grow most anything if a man put his mind to it. The house itself stood half-finished, a testament to dreams interrupted. Sarah had picked out the plans from a catalogue back in Denver, her eyes bright with visions of children running through the rooms, Sunday dinners around a proper table, curtains dancing in the breeze from windows that looked out over their kingdom. But Sarah was buried in the small cemetery behind the church now, along with the son they'd never gotten to meet. And Thatch had stopped working on the house the day he'd laid them both in the ground. The barn where he'd offered Eleanor shelter stood solid and weatherproof. He'd finished that much before his world came apart. It housed his horses, his tools, and now, apparently, a schoolteacher who'd arrived on yesterday's stage with nothing but dignity and determination. Eleanor Finch, even her name sounded refined, like something out of one of those books Sarah used to read. Thatch had watched her step down from the dusty stagecoach, her dark blue traveling dress showing every mile of the journey, but her bearing straight as a pine. She'd carried herself like a woman who knew her worth, even when life had stripped away everything else. The town of Dustvale wasn't much to look at anymore. Main Street stretched for 3 blocks, lined with buildings that had seen their best days come and go. Henderson's General Store still did steady business, run by Mrs. Whitmore, since her husband passed 2 winters back. Doc Henley kept his practice above the store, serving the scattered ranches and the stubborn folks who refused to let the town die. Sheriff Brooks maintained order among the maybe 200 souls who called this place home, though his biggest challenges these days were settling disputes over water rights and keeping the occasional drifter moving along. The schoolhouse had stood empty for near on 2 years now, ever since Miss Patterson married young Tom Fletcher and moved to his family's spread up in Colorado. The children had been making do with whatever learning their parents could provide, which wasn't much considering most folks out here had their hands full just keeping food on the table. Thatch drained his cold coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. His morning chores wouldn't wait for his brooding, and there was always something that needed tending on a working ranch. He'd built his life around routine these past 3 years up before dawn, tend the horses, check the fence lines, fix whatever had broken overnight. It kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere good. As he walked toward the barn, he could hear movement inside. Eleanor was already awake, probably had been for an hour or more. He'd heard her stirring before first light, the quiet sounds of someone trying not to disturb others, even when she had every right to make noise. It was consideration he hadn't expected, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The barn door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see her kneeling beside her trunk, carefully folding what looked like a nightgown. She'd made herself a small space in the corner, neat and tidy, with her belongings arranged just so. A wash basin sat on an upturned crate, alongside a mirror that had seen better days, and a hairbrush with a silver handle that caught the morning light. She looked up when his shadow fell across the doorway, and he was struck again by the directness of her gaze. Eleanor Finch had eyes the color of storm clouds, grey with flecks of blue that seemed to shift with her thoughts. They were eyes that had seen trouble and sorrow, but hadn't given up hope. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said, rising to her feet with the kind of grace that spoke of good breeding and careful education. "I hope my presence didn't disturb your rest." "No, ma'am," he replied, removing his hat as Sarah had taught him to do in the presence of a lady. "Sleep well." Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. "Well enough, thank you. The hay makes for softer bedding than one might expect." He noticed she'd hung a blanket across one corner of the barn, creating a makeshift privacy screen. It was a practical solution, and it spoke to her determination to make the best of whatever circumstances she found herself in. Most women would have complained about sleeping in a barn, would have demanded better accommodations, or taken the next stage out of town. Eleanor had simply adapted. "There's coffee in the house," he found himself saying, though he hadn't planned the words. "And biscuits from yesterday, if you've a mind for breakfast." Something flickered across her face, of surprise, maybe, or gratitude. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Cole. I'd be much obliged." They walked to the house in companionable silence, their footsteps crunching on the hard-packed earth. Thatch found himself noticing things he'd stopped seeing years ago. The way the morning light painted the distant hills, gold, the sound of meadowlarks calling from the fence posts. The smell of sage carried on the breeze. Having another person beside him made the familiar landscape seem somehow more vivid, more present. The kitchen was the one room in the house he'd kept in working order, mainly because a man had to eat. It held a cast-iron stove, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with the basic provisions of bachelor living. Eleanor's gaze swept the space with the practiced eye of someone who knew her way around domestic arrangements. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the stove. "Course." She moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire and setting water to boil. Her hands were steady and sure, the hands of a woman accustomed to taking care of herself and others. Thatch found himself watching the way she moved, the small rituals of someone who found comfort in useful work. "You've been alone here long?" she asked as she worked, her tone carefully neutral. 3 years, give or take." She nodded, not pressing for details he wasn't ready to share. It was another kindness he hadn't expected. Most folks in a small town knew everyone's business, and the few visitors who came through usually wanted the whole story laid out for their entertainment. The coffee was better than anything he'd managed to make on his own, rich and strong without the bitter edge that came from leaving grounds too long on the heat. Eleanor had found his last eggs and made them into something that resembled a proper meal, with biscuits warmed and butter that she must have brought in her own supplies. They ate without much conversation, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence he'd feared. Eleanor seemed content to let the morning speak for itself, the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle, the peaceful rhythm of 2 people sharing a simple meal. "I'll be looking for work," she said finally, setting down her fork. "I'm a qualified teacher, with references if anyone cares to see them. I understand the school's been closed, but there must be children hereabouts who could use some learning." "There are," Thatch admitted. "Henderson's got 3 young ones, and the Millers have a passel of kids who've never seen the inside of a schoolroom. Problem is, nobody's got money to pay for teaching." Eleanor's smile was soft but determined. "We'll see about that. Sometimes the best education doesn't come with a price tag attached." Something in her voice made him look at her more closely. This wasn't a woman who gave up easily, he realized. Whatever had brought her to Dustvale with nothing but a trunk and her dignity, she hadn't come here to surrender to circumstances. "You planning to stay long?" he asked, not sure why the answer mattered to him. "That depends," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "on whether there's a place for me here, and whether I can make myself useful to folks who might need what I have to offer." She stood then, beginning to clear the dishes, with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in preparing the meal. Thatch watched her work, feeling something stir in his chest that he'd thought was buried along with Sarah and their son. It wasn't desire, exactly, or even attraction in the way he'd known it before. It was something quieter and deeper, a recognition of competence and strength, of someone who might understand what it meant to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop. "The school bell," he said suddenly, "still hanging in the old schoolhouse, though it's been silent quite a spell. Might be worth a look if you've got time for exploring." Eleanor's face brightened with genuine interest. "I'd like that very much. A school is more than just a building, but the building matters too. Children need a place that feels special, set apart for learning." After she'd gone walking toward town with the purposeful stride of someone who knew how to get things done, Thatch stood in his quiet kitchen and wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. Eleanor Finch was clearly more than just a displaced teacher looking for shelter. She had plans, and the kind of determined energy that could reshape a place like Dustvale, whether folks were ready for it or not. He found himself hoping they were. Eleanor's first night in the barn had been an exercise in dignity over comfort. The hay was soft enough, as she'd told Thatch, but the sounds were unfamiliar, horses shifting in their stalls, mice scurrying through the rafters, the wind finding every gap in the weathered boards. She'd lain awake listening to the night sounds of a working ranch, thinking about the choices that had brought her here and the uncertain path ahead. By morning, she'd made a decision. If she was going to stay in Dustvale, something about this place and its people made her want to try. She needed to establish herself as more than just a charity case sleeping in someone's barn. She needed to be useful, needed to contribute something of value to this struggling community. After her breakfast with Thatch, she'd walked the 3 blocks to town, taking measure of what remained of Dustvale's commercial district. Mrs. Whitmore at the general store had been welcoming enough, though clearly curious about the stranger who'd arrived with so little fanfare. The elderly woman had grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and kind eyes that missed nothing. "You're the teacher staying out at the coal place," Mrs. Whitmore had said, not quite making it a question. "I am, Eleanor Finch." She'd extended her hand with the same confidence she'd shown in countless school board meetings back east. "I understand the school's been closed for some time." 2 years come September. Miss Patterson was a sweet girl, but she had her heart set on marrying and moving on. Can't say as I blame her. Teaching's a hard profession for a woman alone. Eleanor had smiled at that. Perhaps, though I've found that being alone doesn't necessarily mean being without purpose. The schoolhouse sat at the end of Main Street, a simple wooden building that had seen better days but retained good bones. The door stood unlocked, and Eleanor had pushed it open to reveal a single large room with windows on 3 sides and a raised platform where the teacher's desk would have sat. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, and the floorboards creaked familiarly under her feet. But it was the bell that captured her attention. It hung from a rope beside the front door, tarnished with age but still solid. Eleanor had reached up and given it a gentle test, and the sound that emerged was clear and true, a call to learning that had been silent too long. She'd spent the afternoon exploring the town, introducing herself to the scattered families and taking informal inventory of the children who might benefit from proper schooling. The Hendricks family lived in a modest farmhouse a mile outside town, where she'd met Martha Hendricks and her 3 children, Sam, age 12, Beth, 10, and little Mary, who couldn't have been more than 6. "Sam can read some," Martha had told her, wiping flour, dusted hands on her apron. "Taught him what I could, but there's only so much a body can do when there's crops to tend and babies to mind." Eleanor had knelt to Mary's level, smiling at the shy child who peeked out from behind her mother's skirts. "What would you like to learn, Mary?" "Letters," the little girl had whispered. "Mama says letters make words, and words make stories." It was exactly the kind of spark Eleanor had been hoping to find. These children were hungry for knowledge, eager to discover the worlds that books could open for them. All they needed was someone willing to show them the way. But when she'd returned to Thatcher's ranch that evening, she'd found herself facing an unexpected obstacle. She'd walked to the house to thank him for the morning's hospitality and to ask about using water from his well, only to discover that the front door stood open. Through the doorway, she could see a parlor shrouded in dust covers, furniture arranged as if the occupants had simply stepped out for an afternoon and never returned. Curiosity had gotten the better of caution. Eleanor had stepped inside, drawn by glimpses of a life interrupted. The parlor held a sofa and 2 chairs arranged around a cold fireplace, with a small table that still bore the circular stain of a long-forgotten teacup. But it was the sewing basket beside one of the chairs that caught her attention, a wicker basket filled with fabric scraps and half-finished projects, as if someone had set down their needle intending to return in just a moment. She'd been examining a piece of delicate blue fabric, wondering at the story behind its abandonment, when heavy footsteps on the porch announced Thatcher's return from his afternoon chores. "What the hell are you doing in here?" The words cracked like a whip, harsh with anger and something deeper pain, so raw it made Eleanor's chest tighten with sympathy. Thatch filled the doorway like a thundercloud, his face dark with fury and his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly, carefully setting down the fabric. "The door was open, and I—" "You had no right." His voice was quiet now, but no less intense. "This isn't the barn. This isn't your space to go wandering through." Eleanor straightened, meeting his anger with calm dignity. "You're absolutely right. I overstepped, and I apologize. But may I say something? Make it quick." She gestured toward the sewing basket, toward the dust-covered furniture and the sad emptiness of rooms that should have been filled with life. Whoever lived here, whoever loved here, they wouldn't want this. They wouldn't want these rooms locked away like a tomb, gathering dust and sorrow. Thatcher's jaw worked silently, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might order her off his land entirely. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the abandoned parlor with the echoes of old grief hanging in the air like cobwebs. But Eleanor Finch had not survived the loss of her own husband and the collapse of her old life by backing down from difficult truths. She'd followed Thatch onto the porch, where he stood gripping the railing like a man trying to keep himself anchored to the earth. "I lost someone too," she said simply. "My husband. Not 3 years ago like yours, but 5, and I know something about rooms that hurt to enter and dreams that feel too painful to remember." He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense. "But I also know something about waste," Eleanor continued, "and letting good things rot from neglect is a waste that serves no one, not the living, and certainly not the dead." "You don't know anything about it," Thatch said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "I know enough." Eleanor moved to stand beside him at the railing, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his frame, but careful not to crowd him. "I know that whoever she was, she had good taste in fabric and skill with a needle. I know she planned to make curtains for these windows there, our measurements penciled on some of the cloth. And I know she wouldn't want you living like a ghost in a house that's forgotten how to be a home." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of evening wind through the cottonwoods and the distant call of a meadowlark. Finally, Thatch spoke. "Sarah." Her name was Sarah. "Sarah," Eleanor repeated gently, testing the name like a prayer. "She was your wife." "My wife. And the mother of my son, though he never drew breath in this world." Thatcher's hands relaxed slightly on the railing. She picked out every piece of fabric in that basket, had plans for each room, ideas about how everything should look when it was finished. Eleanor nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. "And now you can't bear to see those plans completed because it feels like moving on without her." Something like that. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun settled toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "What if I told you I needed those curtains, not for sentiment or decoration, but for privacy and basic comfort while I'm staying in your barn?" Thatch turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable. "I'm not asking for charity," Eleanor continued. "I'm offering to finish what Sarah started if you'll let me, not to replace her or erase her memory, but to honor the good work she began." Why? The question was simple, but she heard the weight of deeper questions behind it. Why care? Why stay? Why involve herself in the griefs of a stranger? Eleanor smiled, feeling the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Because everyone deserves to have their good intentions come to fruition. And because I suspect Sarah would have liked the idea of her curtains being sewn by someone who understands what it means to make a home from broken pieces. That night, as Eleanor settled into her makeshift bed in the barn, she found a bundle wrapped in brown paper beside her belongings. Inside were Sarah's fabric scraps and sewing supplies, along with a note written in Thatcher's careful hand. For the curtains, she would have wanted them finished. Eleanor held the fabric to her chest and smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of turning a house back into a home, one careful stitch at a time. The morning after Thatch had given her Sarah's sewing supplies, Eleanor woke with purpose singing in her veins. She'd spent half the night planning her approach not just to the curtains, but to the larger project of establishing herself as a valuable member of this small community. Teaching was more than a profession for her. It was a calling that had sustained her through her own dark times, and she sensed that Dustvale needed what she had to offer. After a quick breakfast of coffee and leftover biscuits, Eleanor set out to explore the town more thoroughly. Her first stop was the abandoned schoolhouse, where she wanted to examine the building's condition and potential for restoration. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and the wooden structure looked better in daylight than it had the previous afternoon. The schoolhouse had good bones, as her father used to say, about buildings worth saving. The roof showed no obvious leaks, the windows were intact, and the floor seemed solid underfoot. Someone had built this place to last, with an eye toward serving generations of children. The desks had been stacked in one corner, along with a blackboard that had seen better days but could still serve its purpose. But it was the bell that truly captured her imagination. Eleanor climbed onto a chair and examined the rope mechanism, testing its strength and checking the bell itself for cracks or damage. The bronze was tarnished but sound, and when she gave it a proper ring, the tone carried clear and true across the empty lot and down Main Street. The sound brought Mrs. Whitmore hurrying from her store, wiping her hands on her apron and squinting against the morning sun. "Miss Finch, everything all right over there?" "Perfectly fine, Mrs. Whitmore. I was just testing the school bell." Eleanor climbed down from the chair and brushed dust from her skirt. "It has a lovely voice, doesn't it?" "That it does. Been silent so long, I'd forgotten how it sounded." The older woman approached with cautious curiosity. "You thinking of opening the school again?" "I'm considering it. Tell me, how many children are there in and around Dustvale who might benefit from regular instruction?" Mrs. Whitmore's face brightened with genuine interest. "Well, let's see. The Hendricks have their 3, and the Millers have 5, ranging from 6 to 14. The Pratts have 2 boys, and there's the Morrison twin-suite girls, but wild as March hares without proper schooling. That's mercy, that's 13 children right there, and I'm not counting the little ones who aren't quite ready yet." 13 children. Eleanor felt her heart lift at the number. It was enough for a proper classroom, enough to create the kind of learning community she'd always dreamed of fostering. And the families? Do you think they'd be interested in regular schooling for their children? Interested, certainly, whether they could pay for it. Mrs. Whitmore shrugged helplessly. "Times are hard, Miss Finch. The drought took most of last year's crops, and with the railroad passing us by, there's not much cash money to be found." Eleanor had expected as much. In her experience, the communities that needed education most were often those least able to afford it. But she'd learned long ago that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. What if payment wasn't required? She asked carefully. What if education could be exchanged for other forms of contribution, help with building maintenance, supplies for the classroom, assistance with community projects? Mrs. Whitmore's eyes widened. You mean like a trade arrangement? Exactly. The Hendricks might contribute fresh vegetables for school lunches. The Millers might help repair the schoolhouse roof. Everyone contributing what they can, working together for the benefit of all the children. My word, Mrs. Whitmore breathed. That's actually quite brilliant, like the old barn raising traditions, but for learning. Eleanor spent the morning walking through town and visiting the scattered homesteads, introducing herself to families and gently exploring their interest in her proposed educational arrangements. The response was overwhelmingly positive, tinged with the kind of desperate hope that came from watching children grow up without proper opportunities. At the Hendricks farm, she found young Sam helping his father repair a broken wagon wheel while his sisters gathered eggs from the henhouse. Martha Hendricks invited Eleanor to sit on the porch with a cup of mint tea, and the two women talked while watching the children at their chores. Sam's bright as a new penny, Martha said, pride evident in her voice, but he asks questions I can't answer anymore, about how machines work, about places beyond these hills, about books we don't have. And Beth? Mary? Beth's got the makings of a fine artist, if she had the chance to learn proper techniques, always drawing pictures in the dirt or on scraps of paper. And little Mary, Martha smiled fondly. That child has the most amazing memory. Tell her a story once, and she can repeat it word for word a week later. Eleanor watched the children as their mother spoke, noting the way Sam approached problems with methodical curiosity, how Beth found beauty in the arrangement of simple objects, how Mary listened intently to every word of adult conversation. These were minds hungry for knowledge, spirits ready to soar if given the chance. Would you be willing to help establish a proper school? Eleanor asked. I'm thinking of classes held outside initially under the cottonwood trees at Mr. Cole's ranch, if he's agreeable. Fresh air, natural beauty, and plenty of space for active learning. Martha's face lit up with genuine excitement. You mean it? You'd really teach our children? I would consider it an honor. By afternoon, Eleanor had visited 6 families and received enthusiastic support from all of them. The community was more ready for change than she dared hope, hungry for the kind of growth and improvement that education could bring. Now she needed to approach Thatcher about using his land for outdoor classes, a conversation that would require delicacy and careful timing. She found him working on fence repairs in the south pasture, his shirt damp with sweat and his concentration focused on the precise placement of wire and posts. Eleanor approached quietly, not wanting to startle him while he worked with potentially dangerous tools. Mr. Cole? He looked up, wiping perspiration from his forehead with his sleeve. Miss Finch, how was your day in town? Productive, I hope. I've been speaking with families about establishing a school for their children. Thatch straightened, giving her his full attention. And there are 13 children in and around Dustvale who could benefit from regular instruction. Their families are eager for the opportunity, willing to contribute what they can in exchange for education. That's good news for the children. Eleanor took a breath, gathering her courage for the request she needed to make. I was wondering if you might consider allowing me to hold classes on your land. Under the cottonwood trees near the house, perhaps. The setting would be perfect for outdoor learning, and it would solve the immediate problem of not having a proper schoolhouse. Thatch was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Eleanor to the grove of trees she'd mentioned. She could see him weighing the request, considering the implications of having children and families regularly visiting his property. How many days a week? He asked finally. 3 to start. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Morning sessions for the younger children, afternoon for the older ones. And you'd be responsible for supervising them? Making sure they don't get into trouble or disturb the livestock? Completely responsible. I've managed classrooms for 15 years, Mr. Cole. I understand the importance of maintaining order and safety. Thatch nodded slowly, and Eleanor held her breath while he made his decision. "All right," he said finally, "you can use the grove, but we'll need to set up some basic seating, maybe a table for your supplies." Eleanor's smile was radiant with gratitude and excitement. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to these families, to these children." "I reckon I might," Thatch said quietly, returning to his fence work. "Every child deserves a chance to learn." As Eleanor walked back toward the house, she felt the familiar thrill of a new beginning taking shape. Tomorrow, she would begin sewing Sarah's curtains and planning her first outdoor lessons. The broken bell in the abandoned schoolhouse might remain silent for now, but the sound of children's voices learning and growing would soon fill the air under Thatcher's cottonwood trees. The first week of Eleanor's outdoor school exceeded even her optimistic expectations. Word had spread quickly through the scattered community, and on that first Monday morning, she found herself welcoming not just the 13 children she'd anticipated, but 16 eager faces ranging in age from 5 to 15. They gathered under the spreading branches of Thatcher's cottonwood trees, like a congregation called to worship at the altar of learning. Eleanor had spent the weekend preparing, sewing late into the evening by lamplight, and planning lessons that would engage children of varied ages and abilities. Sarah's curtains were taking shape, beautifully simple but elegant panels that would transform the stark windows of Thatcher's house into something welcoming and warm. The work gave her hands something to do, while her mind organized curriculum and teaching strategies. She'd also discovered something unexpected while cleaning the sewing supplies. A small pocket watch tucked beneath the fabric scraps, its gold case tarnished and its mechanism silent. The inscription on the back read, "To Thomas Cole with love and pride, Father, 1852. Thatcher's father's watch, apparently broken and forgotten in the chaos of grief. Eleanor had always been good with small mechanisms, a skill learned from her own father, who'd been a clockmaker before moving west to practice medicine. She'd spent her free moments over the weekend, carefully cleaning and adjusting the delicate gears, coaxing the timepiece back to life. There was something deeply satisfying about restoring broken things to their intended purpose. The watch now sat on her bedside crate in the barn, keeping perfect time and waiting for the right moment to return it to its rightful owner. The children had arrived for their first lesson with the wide-eyed excitement of explorers discovering new territory. Eleanor had arranged logs and wooden crates to create natural seating areas, with a large flat stone serving as her teaching surface. She'd brought her own books, slate boards, and writing materials, but also incorporated the natural world around them into every lesson. Learning doesn't only happen indoors, she'd told them as they settled into their outdoor classroom. The whole world is our schoolroom, and every day offers new lessons if we know how to look. Young Mary Hendricks had raised her tiny hand. "Can we learn about the birds, Miss Finch? I want to know why they sing different songs." "Certainly. We'll study nature alongside our letters and numbers. Science and literature, mathematics and music, they're all connected if you understand how to see the patterns." Sam Hendricks, at 12, the oldest boy in the group, had been skeptical at first. "My pa says book learning's fine for townfolk, but ranch work's what matters out here." Eleanor had smiled at his challenge. "Your father's absolutely right that ranch work matters. But tell me, Samwen, you're deciding how much feed to give the cattle, aren't you using mathematics? When you're reading the sky for weather signs, isn't that a form of science? When you're planning which fields to plant, aren't you thinking about geography and seasons?" The boy's expression had shifted from skepticism to curiosity. I guess I never thought about it that way." "That's because you're already educated, Sam. You just don't realize it yet. My job is to help you understand how much you already know, and then build on that foundation." Beth Hendricks had shyly shown Eleanor a drawing she'd made of a butterfly, and Eleanor had seen immediately that the girl had an artist's eye for detail and proportion. The Morrison twins, despite their reputation for wildness, had listened intently to a story about brave explorers, their imagination clearly captured by tales of adventure and discovery. By the end of that first week, Eleanor had established routines that worked beautifully in their outdoor setting. Morning lessons focused on basic skills reading, writing, and arithmetic, while afternoons were devoted to what she called discovery learning. They studied plants and insects, practiced storytelling, learned songs that helped them remember multiplication tables, and discussed the wider world beyond their small valley. The parents began stopping by to observe the classes, initially skeptical but quickly won over by their children's obvious engagement and enthusiasm. Martha Hendricks had arrived on Wednesday to find her youngest daughter confidently reading aloud to a group of older children, and tears had filled her eyes at the sight. "I never thought Mary would learn to read so young," she'd whispered to Eleanor. "She's not even 6 years old." "Children learn when they're ready and interested," Eleanor had replied. "Mary has a remarkable memory and a natural love of language. She'll be reading chapter books before Christmas if we nurture that gift properly." Thatcher had been a more complicated audience. Eleanor was aware of him watching from a distance, working on nearby fence repairs or tending to chores that happened to bring him within earshot of the lessons. He never approached directly, but she sensed his attention and approval in the careful way he'd arranged additional seating and the fact that he'd set up a small table for her teaching materials without being asked. On Friday afternoon, after the children had been collected by their families, Eleanor had found Thatcher sitting on his porch with the pocket watch in his hands. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the gentle movement of his thumb across the polished case. "It keeps perfect time," she'd said quietly, settling into the rocking chair beside his. "Your father had excellent taste in timepieces." "How did you know it was his?" "The inscription, and the fact that it was carefully wrapped and stored with items that mattered to someone." Eleanor had paused, choosing her words carefully. "I hope you don't mind that I repaired it. I couldn't bear to see something so beautiful sitting broken when it could be fixed." Thatcher had wound the watch carefully, listening to its steady tick. "Sarah tried to get it working once, said a man should carry his father's watch, but the mechanism was beyond her skills." She was right about a man carrying his father's watch. Some traditions connect us to the people who came before, remind us that we're part of something larger than just our own lives. They'd sat in comfortable silence as the sun settled toward the horizon, the watch marking time between them like a small heartbeat. Finally, Thatcher had spoken. "The children seem to like your teaching. They're remarkable students, eager, intelligent, full of natural curiosity. You should be proud of what this community has raised. Their parents are good people. They work hard, care about their families, just haven't had many opportunities for advancement." Eleanor had sensed an opening in his words, a hint that he understood the larger implications of what she was trying to accomplish. Education can change that, not overnight, but gradually. Children who learn to read and think critically grow up to create opportunities, not just wait for them. "You really believe that?" "I've seen it happen. A child who learns to love books becomes an adult who can navigate the wider world. A student who masters mathematics can manage finances, plan investments, build something lasting. Knowledge is the one thing that can't be taken away once it's truly learned." Thatcher had nodded slowly, his fingers still tracing the smooth case of the pocket watch. "Sarah would have liked you," he'd said finally. "She believed in the power of learning too, always reading, always curious about how things worked. I would have liked her too, I think. Anyone who chose that beautiful fabric and planned those graceful curtains clearly had an eye for both beauty and practicality." As if summoned by her words, a gentle breeze had stirred the curtains. Eleanor had hung that morning in the parlor windows. Sarah's fabric transformed into graceful panels that caught the evening light and made the house look welcoming for the first time in 3 years. "They look good," Thatcher had said, his voice soft with something that might have been gratitude or peace. "They look like home," Eleanor had replied, and meant it completely. 3 weeks into the school's operation, Eleanor had established routines that felt as natural as breathing. The children arrived each morning with the sun, eager for the day's discoveries, and departed in the afternoon chattering about lessons learned and questions sparked. The outdoor classroom had taken on a life of its own, with families contributing improvements, additional seating, a weatherproof storage box for supplies, even a simple awning to provide shade during the hottest part of the day. But it was during the quiet evening hours, when the children had gone home and the ranch settled into peaceful silence, that Eleanor found herself growing most comfortable in this new life. She and Thatch had fallen into an easy rhythm of shared meals and gentle conversation, their exchanges growing deeper and more personal as trust developed between them. It was on a Thursday evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky, that Eleanor chose to share the story she'd kept hidden since her arrival. "I was married once," she said quietly, her fingers unconsciously touching the chain that held her wedding ring beneath her dress. "His name was Dr. James Finch, and he was the kindest man I've ever known." Thatch set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. In the weeks since she'd arrived, he'd shown himself to be a careful listener, someone who understood the weight of words offered in confidence. "We met in Boston," Eleanor continued, her voice soft with memory. "I was teaching at a private academy for young ladies, and he was completing his medical training at Harvard. He had this wonderful dream of bringing proper medical care to frontier communities, places where doctors were scarce and people suffered for lack of knowledge." The chain around her neck caught the moonlight as she pulled it free, revealing a simple gold band that had been worn smooth by years of handling. "We came west together 5 years ago, full of plans and hope. James established a practice in a small town in Colorado, unlike Dustvale actually. Remote, struggling, but filled with good people who deserved better care than they'd been receiving." "What happened?" Thatcher's voice was gentle, understanding that some stories required careful telling. "Cholera epidemic, 2 summers ago. James worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, determined to save everyone he could. He was so focused on his patients that he forgot to take proper precautions for himself." Eleanor's smile was sad but not bitter. "He died doing exactly what he'd always wanted to do, serving people who needed him." She was quiet for a moment, remembering the terrible beauty of James's dedication, the way he'd faced impossible odds with unwavering compassion. "After he passed, the town couldn't afford to keep paying me to teach. The school board suggested I might be happier returning to my family in Boston, where a woman alone wouldn't face such challenges." "But you didn't go back?" "No, I couldn't. James and I had built something meaningful in that community, and I wasn't ready to abandon it. But eventually, circumstances made the decision for me. The school closed entirely, and there was no other work to be found." Thatch was quiet, absorbing her story with the careful attention of someone who understood loss and difficult choices. "So you came to Texas. I heard there were opportunities for teachers in frontier communities. Dustvale was recommended by a woman I met at a boarding house in Denver. She said it was a good town full of decent people who could use some help with their children's education. And you came alone, with nothing but a trunk and your determination." Eleanor's smile was stronger now, touched with the resilience that had carried her through the hardest times. "I've learned that sometimes starting over means leaving almost everything behind, except the parts of yourself that truly matter. Teaching is who I am, not just what I do. As long as there are children who need to learn, I'll find a way to serve that purpose." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night air filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Finally, Thatch spoke. "James sounds like he was a good man. The best. He would have liked you, I think. You have the same quality of quiet strength, the same way of caring for others, without making a show of it." Eleanor tucked the ring back beneath her dress, but left the chain visible, a small sign of trust and openness that Thatch recognized for what it was. "What about you? Will you tell me about Sarah?" Thatch was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "Met her in Denver, at a church social. I was in town selling cattle, and she was visiting her sister's family. Most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the way she talked to every honoric folks, poor folks, children, elderly people. She had this gift for making everyone feel important. His voice grew softer as the memories took hold. We courted for 6 months, writing letters back and forth. She knew what ranch life would be like, understood it wouldn't be easy or glamorous. But she said she'd rather build something meaningful with someone she loved than live comfortably with someone who didn't understand her dreams. What were her dreams? Family, mainly. Children learning and growing, a house filled with laughter and love. She wanted to create the kind of home where people felt welcome, where neighbors became extended family. Thatcher's smile was tinged with old pain. She was carrying our son when the fever took her. We'd already picked out his name, Thomas, after my father. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the tragedy of lives cut short, plans never fulfilled. She sounds wonderful. She was, and she would have loved what you've done with the children, the way you've brought learning and joy to this community. Sarah always believed that education was the key to building better lives. They talked until late that night, sharing memories and dreams with the kind of honesty that comes when two people recognize kindred spirits in each other. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Boston, her father's clockmaking business, her mother's poetry, and the books that had shaped her understanding of the world. Thatch spoke of his father's ranch, the seasons of hard work and simple pleasures, the satisfaction of building something lasting with your own hands. As they finally prepared to retire for the night, Eleanor felt something shift between them, not romance, exactly, but a deeper understanding and appreciation. They were two people who had loved deeply and lost greatly, who understood that life's most precious gifts often came wrapped in sorrow and struggle. "Thank you," Thatch said as they stood to go inside. "For what?" "For bringing this place back to life, for making it feel like a home again, instead of just a house where someone happens to sleep." Eleanor's smile was warm with genuine affection. "Thank you for giving me the chance to belong somewhere again. I'd forgotten how good it feels to be part of a community, to have work that matters." As she settled into her bed in the barn that night, Eleanor realized that for the first time since James's death, she felt truly hopeful about the future. Not because she was forgetting her past or abandoning her love for her late husband, but because she was learning that the human heart was vast enough to hold both grief and joy, both memory and new possibility. Tomorrow would bring another day of teaching, another opportunity to watch young minds discover the magic of learning. And tomorrow evening would bring another chance to sit on the porch with Thatch, sharing the quiet companionship of two people who had found unexpected friendship in the midst of healing. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she'd stepped off the stage in Dustvale with nothing but her dignity and determination. It was enough to build a future on. As autumn settled over Dustvale, bringing cooler mornings and the first hints of changing leaves, Eleanor found herself facing an unexpected challenge. While cleaning Thatcher's study room he'd avoided for 3 years, she discovered a wooden box tucked behind his father's old desk. Inside were dozens of letters, all written in Thatcher's careful hand but never sent. They were love letters to Sarah, written after her death. Eleanor stood in the dusty study, holding the evidence of a man's desperate attempt to maintain connection with someone beyond reach. The letters chronicled everything: his daily struggles with grief, his guilt over not being able to save her, his fears about forgetting the sound of her voice or the way she laughed at his terrible jokes. They were raw, honest, and heartbreaking in their devotion. She carefully returned the letters to their box, but the discovery troubled her deeply. Not because she was jealous of Sarah's memory. Eleanor understood that love didn't diminish by being shared or remembered, but because she recognized the dangerous pattern of a man trapped in his grief, unable to move forward because moving forward felt like betrayal. That evening, as they shared their usual dinner on the porch, Eleanor found herself watching Thatch with new understanding. She saw how he sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if listening for a voice that would never answer. She noticed the way his eyes would drift toward the empty chair beside him, the chair that had been Sarah's favorite spot for watching sunsets. "Thatch," she said gently, setting down her fork, "may I ask you something personal?" He looked up from his plate, recognizing the serious tone in her voice. Course. Do you think Sarah would want you to spend the rest of your life writing letters she'll never read? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thatcher's jaw tightened, and Eleanor saw a flash of the anger she'd encountered that first day when she'd entered his house uninvited. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Eleanor's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. I found the letters, Thatch, in the study. Dozens of them, all addressed to Sarah, all filled with beautiful words she'll never have the chance to hear. Thatcher's hands clenched on the table. You had no right. You're absolutely correct. I overstepped again, and I apologize, but now that I know, I can't pretend I don't. Eleanor leaned forward, her grey eyes intense with conviction. Those letters are keeping you trapped in a conversation that can only go one way. You're pouring your heart out to someone who can't respond, can't tell you that it's all right to stop grieving, can't give you permission to live again. She was my wife. Yes, she was, and she loved you. But love doesn't mean holding someone prisoner to your grief, Thatch. It means honoring what they gave you by using it to build something meaningful with the time you have left. The silence stretched between them, filled with tension and the weight of truths neither had expected to voice. Finally, Thatch spoke. You don't understand. If I stop writing to her, if I stop talking to her, it's like losing her all over again. Eleanor's expression softened with deep compassion. Oh, my dear man, you're not losing her by living. You're losing yourself by dying a little more each day. She reached across the table and covered his clenched fist with her small, strong hand. I wrote letters to James, too, after he died, hundreds of them. I told him about my days, asked his advice, begged him to somehow let me know he was at peace. But eventually, I realized that the James that was writing to wasn't really James anymore. He was my fear of letting go, my guilt over surviving when he didn't. Thatcher's resistance was visible in every line of his body, but Eleanor pressed on. The real James would have wanted me to live fully, to love again if I found someone worthy of it, to use the gifts he'd helped me discover, rather than burying them with him. And I believe the real Sarah would want the same for you. How can you know that? Because I know what kind of woman chooses your fabric, plans your curtains, creates the kind of home you've described. A woman like that doesn't love selfishly. She loves with generosity and hope, wanting the best possible life for the person she cares about. That night, Eleanor lay awake in the barn, wondering if she'd pushed too hard, said too much. The conversation had ended with Thatch excusing himself abruptly, his face shuttered and his manner distant. She'd seen the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between a heart ready to heal and a mind convinced that healing meant betrayal. Meanwhile, other challenges were developing that would test their growing community in new ways. Reports had been filtering in from neighboring ranches about cattle rustlers operating in the area, organized thieves who targeted isolated properties and made off with entire herds under cover of darkness. Sheriff Brooks had stopped by the school one afternoon to warn Eleanor about the increased danger. Not saying they'd bother with the children, he'd told her quietly, but these aren't ordinary cattle thieves. They're organized, well-armed, and they don't seem to care much about witnesses. Eleanor had nodded, accepting the warning while internally calculating how to keep her students safe without alarming their families unnecessarily. She'd spoken with Thatch about the situation, and he'd assured her that his ranch was well defended and that he'd be keeping closer watch on the property. But the threat of outside danger seemed to crystallize something in their small community. Families began staying closer together. Fathers took turns riding patrol, and there was a sense of circling the wagons that brought people together in new ways. Eleanor's school became not just a place of learning, but a gathering point where parents could share information and coordinate their responses to potential threats. It was during one of these community meetings, held under the cottonwood trees after regular school hours, that Eleanor truly understood how much their little community had grown and strengthened. Martha Hendricks brought fresh bread and jam, the Millers contributed vegetables from their garden, and even shy Mrs. Praft offered to help with mending and sewing projects for families in need. "We've got something good here," Sheriff Brooks had said, looking around at the gathered families. "Something worth protecting. Miss Finch, what you've started here goes beyond just teaching children their letters. You've reminded us how to be neighbors." Eleanor had felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, the deep satisfaction of work that mattered and community bonds that strengthened rather than weakened under pressure. But her eyes had sought Thatcher in the gathering, and she'd seen him standing slightly apart, watching but not fully participating. Later, after the families had dispersed and they were cleaning up the gathering area, Eleanor approached him carefully. "You seem distant tonight." Thatcher was quiet for a moment, stacking chairs with methodical precision. "Been thinking about what you said, about the letters. And you're right. Sarah wouldn't want me to waste my life writing to a ghost." He paused, his hands stilling on the chair back. "But I don't know how to stop. Those letters are the only conversations I have with her anymore." Eleanor felt her heart constrict with sympathy for his struggle. "What if instead of stopping completely, you changed what you're saying? Instead of telling her about your pain and guilt, what if you told her about the good things? The children learning, the community growing, the ways her dream of a welcoming home is coming true." Thatcher looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. "You think she'd want to hear about that?" "I think she'd be proud of what you've helped create here. Proud of the man you're becoming as you learn to live again." That night, for the first time in 3 years, Thatcher Cole went to sleep without writing a letter to his dead wife. Instead, he lay in his bed, looking at the curtains Eleanor had sewn from Sarah's fabric, listening to the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, where children came each day to discover the joy of learning. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something that might have been peace. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Eleanor had risen before dawn to prepare lessons for her students, and Thatcher was already out checking the fence lines when a lone rider approached the ranch at full gallop. The man was travel-worn and urgent, bearing a letter that would shake the foundations of everything Eleanor had told him about her past. Sheriff Brooks dismounted heavily, his face grim with the weight of unwelcome news. "Miss Finch, this came through the telegraph office in Abilene. Thought you'd want to see it right away." Eleanor accepted the envelope with steady hands, though something in the sheriff's expression made her heart quicken with apprehension. The return address was embossed with expensive paper and formal script. Worthington, Pemberton, Associates, Attorneys at Law, Boston, Massachusetts. She opened it carefully, aware that Thatcher had returned from his morning ride and was watching from near the barn. The contents made her sink onto the porch steps as if her legs had suddenly lost their strength. "My dear Miss Eleanor," the letter began, and she could almost hear her father's voice in the formal phrasing. "It is with great urgency that I write to inform you of developments that require your immediate attention. Your father, Mr. Charles Worthington, suffered a severe apoplectic fit 3 weeks past and remains in grave condition. As his only surviving heir, your presence is required to address matters of considerable import regarding the family estate and business holdings." Eleanor's hand trembled as she continued reading. "Furthermore, it has come to our attention through private inquiry that you have been living in circumstances far beneath your station and education. Your father has authorized me to arrange immediate transportation and accommodation for your return to Boston, where you may resume your rightful place in society. A bank draft for traveling expenses is enclosed, along with tickets for passage on the next available eastbound railroad." The letter went on to detail the scope of her father's business, Empire Textile Mills, shipping interests, real estate holdings that she'd never fully understood the magnitude of. She was not just Eleanor Finch, the displaced schoolteacher. She was Eleanor Worthington, heir to one of Boston's most prominent industrial fortunes. Thatcher approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Eleanor, what is it?" She looked up at him, seeing her own life as if from a great distance. Everything she'd told him about her past was true, but it was only part of the story. She had indeed taught at a private academy, had indeed married Dr. James Finch, and followed him west out of love. But she'd never mentioned that she was the daughter of Charles Worthington, that she'd turned her back on a life of privilege and social prominence to follow her heart. "My father is dying," she said quietly, "and apparently I'm not quite the impoverished schoolteacher I've led everyone to believe." Sheriff Brooks cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The telegraph operator said there's been a man asking questions about you, private investigator, hired by your family to locate you. Seems they've been searching for quite some time." Eleanor felt the weight of two worlds pressing down on her, life she'd chosen and the life she'd been born to. She thought of the children gathering under the cottonwood trees, expecting their morning lessons. She thought of the curtains she'd sewn, the community she'd helped strengthen, the man whose grief she'd helped heal, even as he'd helped her find hope again. "There's more," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. She looked directly at Thatch, knowing he deserved the complete truth. "I didn't come west as some romantic adventure or escape from a difficult situation. I came because I chose love over luxury, purpose over privilege. My father expected me to marry well within Boston society, to be an ornament in drawing rooms and charity committees. Instead, I married a frontier doctor who dreamed of serving people who needed medical care more than they needed social connections." Thatcher's expression was unreadable, but she saw something flicker in his eye. Surprise, certainly, but also a kind of hurt that she hadn't trusted him with the whole truth. "When James died," Eleanor continued, "I could have returned to Boston. My father would have welcomed me back, found me a suitable second husband, ensured I never wanted for material comfort again. But I couldn't bear the thought of that life, not after I'd experienced the satisfaction of meaningful work and authentic relationships." She stood, folding the letter carefully. "The woman you've known for these past months is exactly who I am, Thatch. Not my father's daughter playing at being common folk, but someone who chose to build a life based on purpose rather than position." Sheriff Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, Miss Finch, Miss Worthington, but there's something else you should know. The investigator mentioned that your father's been trying to have your marriage to Dr. Finch declared invalid on some technicality, something about lack of proper consent from family. If that's true, it could affect your legal status, your rights as a widow." Eleanor felt a flash of the old anger she'd thought she'd left behind in Boston. Her father's inability to accept her choices, his need to control every aspect of her life, even from a distance, it was exactly the suffocating environment she'd fled years ago. "Let me understand this clearly," she said, her voice gaining strength. "My father is dying, so he's summoning me home like a wayward child. He's trying to invalidate my marriage to James, presumably so he can arrange a more suitable match for his grieving daughter. And he sent investigators to track me down when I failed to come running at his first summons." "That's about the size of it," Sheriff Brooks confirmed. Thatch finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "What will you do?" It was the question Eleanor had been dreading, because she could see multiple paths stretching before her, each with its own weight of obligation and consequence. Return to Boston, and she could ensure her father's business empire didn't fall into the wrong hands. She could secure her own financial future, live in comfort for the rest of her days. But she would also be returning to a world that had never understood her, never valued the things that mattered most to her. Stay in Dust Vale, and she could continue the work she'd started, keep faith with the community that had embraced her, nurture the feelings that had grown between her and Thatch. But she would be abandoning her responsibilities as her father's heir, potentially allowing his life's work to be destroyed or mismanaged. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This isn't just about me anymore. There are children depending on their education, families who've come to rely on the school. And theirs." She looked at Thatch, seeing the careful distance he was already putting between them. "There are relationships that matter to me." Thatch's smile was sad but understanding. "Eleanor, if you're the daughter of a Boston industrialist, what are you doing in a place like this? What are you doing with someone like me?" "I'm doing exactly what I chose to do," she replied firmly. "I'm teaching children who need education. I'm contributing to a community that values substance over status. And she paused. recognizing that this crisis had clarified feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge. I'm falling in love with a man who judges people by their character rather than their bank accounts. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and complicated by circumstances neither of them had anticipated. Thatcher's expression softened, but Eleanor could see the doubt creeping in the same insecurity that had made him feel unworthy when he'd learned about her education and refinement. Your father's dying, Eleanor. That's not something you can ignore, no matter what your feelings about him might be. No, it's not. She looked at the letter again, at the bank draft that represented more money than most families in Dustvale saw in several years. But going back to Boston doesn't mean staying in Boston. It doesn't mean abandoning everything I've built here. Sheriff Brooks cleared his throat. There's one more thing. The investigator mentioned that your father's lawyers are prepared to take legal action if you don't return voluntarily. Something about you being declared mentally incompetent for choosing to live in such reduced circumstances. Eleanor's laugh was sharp with disbelief. Of course they are. God forbid a Worthington daughter should choose teaching over tea parties, meaningful work over meaningless social obligations. She looked at Thatch, at the ranch that had become home, at the cottonwood trees where her students would soon gather, expecting their teacher to be there. I have to go to Boston, she said quietly. I have to face whatever my father has planned, settle his affairs, and make sure his threats can't touch the life I've chosen to build. And then, Thatcher's voice was careful, as if he was afraid of the answer. And then I come home, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength with certainty. I come home to Dustvale, to the school, to the community that values what I have to offer. I come home to you, if you'll have me. The hope in Thatcher's eyes was worth every difficult conversation she'd have to face in Boston, every battle she'd have to fight to protect the life she'd chosen. But first, she had to survive the confrontation with a past that refused to let her go. The 3 days following Eleanor's revelation passed in a blur of preparation and difficult conversations. Word had spread through Dustvale about the teacher's hidden identity and her impending departure, creating a mixture of shock, admiration, and deep concern about the future of the school. But it was Eleanor's private conversations with Thatch that proved most challenging, as they both struggled to navigate the implications of her true background. I need you to understand something, Eleanor had said on the evening before her departure, as they sat on the porch that had become their sanctuary. Everything I've told you about who I am, what I believe, what matters to me, that's all true. The name on my birth certificate doesn't change any of that. Thatch had been quiet for a long moment, his hands working over the rifle he was cleaning, a nervous habit she'd noticed whenever he was processing difficult emotions. It's not about the money, Eleanor. It's about the choice you'll have to make. What choice? Between the life you were born to and the life you've chosen, between security and uncertainty, between Boston society and a struggling teacher in a dying frontier town. Eleanor had reached for his hands, stilling their restless movement. There's no choice to make, Thatch. I made my choice 5 years ago when I married James and came west. I made it again when I stayed after he died instead of running back to Boston. And I'm making it again now when I tell you that I'm coming back to Dustvale no matter what my father's lawyers threaten or promise. But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor knew the situation was more complicated than her simple declarations could resolve. The cattle rustlers that had been plaguing the area were becoming bolder, and there were reports of increased activity near several neighboring ranches. Sheriff Brooks had stopped by the morning of her departure with disturbing news. They hit the Morrison place last night. He'd told them grimly, took 50 head of cattle and burned the barn, left a message saying anyone who interfered with their operations would face worse. Eleanor had felt her blood chill at the implications. The children are the Morrison twins safe? Family's fine, but they're scared. This isn't random cattle theft anymore, Miss Finch. These men are organized, and they're sending a message that they own this territory now. The news had added urgency to Eleanor's departure preparations, but also created a terrible dilemma. How could she leave Dustvale when the community was facing its greatest threat? How could she abandon her students and the families who had come to depend on her? But Thatch had been firm in his insistence that she go. "Your father's dying, Eleanor. Whatever else he's done, whatever mistakes he's made, he's still your father. You'll regret it for the rest of your life if you don't have the chance to say goodbye." "And what about the rustlers? What about the danger to the community?" "We'll handle it. Sheriff Brooks is organizing the ranchers, and we've got enough good men to protect what's ours. But we can't protect you from your father's lawyers if you don't go back and settle this legal nonsense." Eleanor had spent her last evening in Dustvale, visiting each of her students' families, assuring them that her departure was temporary and that she would return as soon as possible. The conversations had been heartbreaking. Children who didn't understand why their teacher had to leave, parents who feared the loss of the educational opportunities their children had come to treasure. Young Mary Hendricks had clung to Eleanor's skirts, tears streaming down her face. "But who will teach us about the birds, Miss Finch? Who will help us with our letters?" "I'll be back before the snow melts, sweetheart," Eleanor had promised, hoping it was a promise she could keep. "And while I'm gone, you can practice reading the books I'm leaving behind. When I return, you can show me how much you've learned." Sam Hendricks, now 13 and increasingly serious about his studies, had approached her with the kind of adult concern that broke her heart. "Miss Finch, are you really coming back? Or are you going to decide that Boston life is easier than teaching kids like us?" Eleanor had knelt to his level, looking directly into his earnest young face. "Sam, I give you my word. I am coming back to Dustvale, to this school, to all of you. Nothing in Boston can offer me what I've found here: the satisfaction of meaningful work, the joy of watching young minds discover their potential, the warmth of a community that values substance over superficial things." Her final conversation with Thatch had taken place in the pre-dawn darkness of her departure day. They'd stood together in the barn where she'd spent her first night in Dustvale, surrounded by the simple belongings she was leaving behind, as proof of her intention to return. "I'm scared," she'd admitted, allowing herself the vulnerability that came with impending separation. "Not of facing my father or his lawyers, but of what might happen here while I'm gone. The rustlers, the danger to the families, the possibility that something could happen to you." Thatch had pulled her into his arms then, holding her with the careful strength she'd come to associate with safety and belonging. "Nothing's going to happen to me, Eleanor. I've got too much to live for now, too much to protect. This community, this school you've built, the future we're planning together that's worth fighting for. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take unnecessary risks just to prove something to yourself or anyone else." "I promise. And you promise me something too. Anything. Promise me you won't let them convince you that you belong in their world more than you belong here. Don't let guilt or duty or family pressure make you forget what makes you happy." Eleanor had pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and honest work that had become home to her. "I promise. But Thatch, there's something else I need to say before I go." "What's that?" "I love you." The words came easily, naturally, carrying the weight of certainty that had been building for months. Not as a replacement for James, not as a convenient arrangement, but as the man you are right now, in this moment, in this life we're building together. Thatcher's response had been wordless, but eloquent, a kiss that spoke of devotion and hope, and the kind of love that could survive separation and uncertainty. Now, as the stagecoach carried her away from Dustvale toward the railroad connection that would take her back to Boston, Eleanor carried that kiss like a talisman against whatever challenges awaited her. She also carried a loaded derringer in her reticular gift from Sheriff Brooks, who'd insisted she be prepared for trouble during her travels. But more importantly, she carried the certainty that she was not returning to Boston as the prodigal daughter seeking forgiveness and acceptance. She was going as Eleanor Finch, teacher and community builder, woman who had found her calling and her love in the most unlikely of places. Whatever her father's lawyers had planned, whatever legal or social pressures they intended to apply, they would discover that the frightened young woman who had fled Boston 5 years ago no longer existed. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had built something meaningful with her own hands, who had found a love based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social convenience. Eleanor Worthington might have been born to privilege and position, but Eleanor Finch had been forged by purpose and tested by adversity. The confrontation ahead would determine not just her legal status or financial future, but whether she would be allowed to return to the life she had chosen or forced into the life others had planned for her. As the familiar landscape of Texas gave way to the broader horizons of her journey east, Eleanor found herself thinking not of the luxurious townhouse and social obligations awaiting her in Boston, but of cottonwood trees and children's laughter and a tall man with gentle hands who had learned to love again. Meanwhile, back in Dust Vale, the threat of the cattle rustlers was escalating in ways that would test every bond the community had formed. The morning after Eleanor's departure, Thatch had awakened to find his prize bull missing and hoofprints leading toward the hills where the rustlers were known to operate. But more troubling than the theft was the message carved into his barn door. "The schoolmarm's gone. Time for the rest of you to learn your place." The rustlers knew about Eleanor's departure, knew about her connection to the community, and were using her absence to send a message of intimidation. Thatch had stood staring at the crude words, feeling a cold fury build in his chest. These men weren't just stealing cattle, they were attacking the very heart of what made Dust Vale worth defending. Sheriff Brooks had arrived within the hour, along with several of the local ranchers who'd seen the smoke from Thatch's signal fire. The men gathered in his kitchen, their faces grim with the knowledge that the conflict they'd been dreading was finally upon them. "They're getting bolder," Sheriff Brooks had said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly from age and tension. "Hit 3 ranches in 2 days, and now they're leaving messages. They want us scared, want us to pack up and leave so they can have free run of the territory." "How many of them are we dealing with?" asked Miller, whose farm lay closest to the rustlers' suspected hideout. "Best guess? 15 to 20 men, well-armed and organized. They've got someone leading them who knows military tactics, the way they coordinate their raids, the way they've scouted our defenses. This isn't some ragtag group of drifters." Thatch had listened to the discussion with growing determination. These men weren't just threatening his cattle or his property, they were threatening the school, the children, the future that he and Eleanor were building together. "What's our plan?" "We've got 2 choices," Sheriff Brooks had replied. "We can fort up, protect what we can, and hope they move on to easier targets. Or we can take the fight to them, end this before it gets worse. And if we choose to fight, then we're risking everything. Our families, our homes, our lives, but we might also be saving them." The decision, when it came, was unanimous. Every man in the room had too much invested in Dust Vale's future to surrender without a fight. They would defend their community, their families, and the dream of a better life that Eleanor's school had come to represent. As the men dispersed to make their preparations, Thatch had remained behind to write what might be his final letter. But instead of addressing it to Sarah, as had been his habit for 3 years, he found himself writing to Eleanor. "My dearest Eleanor," he began, his pen steady despite the weight of what he was facing. "By the time you read this, you'll know whether the men of Dust Vale were strong enough to protect what you helped us build. I want you to know that whatever happens, these past months with you have been the best of my life since Sarah died. You taught me that the heart can hold both grief and joy, that love doesn't diminish by being shared, and that home is something you build with the people who matter most to you." He paused, thinking of her on the train to Boston, probably worrying about the community she'd left behind. "Don't blame yourself if things go badly here. Don't let guilt or regret keep you from living the life you've chosen. You've given us more than we ever had the right to expect: hope, purpose, and the knowledge that we're worth fighting for. Whatever your father's lawyers demand, whatever pressures they apply, remember that you have a home here with people who love you for exactly who you are." The letter went on to detail his plans for the ranch, his hopes for the school's future, and his absolute certainty that what they'd built together was worth any sacrifice required to preserve it. But most importantly, it contained his promise to survive the coming conflict and be waiting for her return. "I love you, Eleanor Finch," he concluded, "not as a convenient arrangement or a healing balm for old wounds, but as the woman who brought my heart back to life and showed me that the future can be even more beautiful than the past. Come home to us. Come home to me." As he sealed the letter and placed it with his other important papers, Thatch felt a sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine Dustvale's fate, but tonight he could rest in the knowledge that he was fighting for something worth preserve. A community built on mutual support, a school that nurtured young minds, and a love that had grown strong enough to survive whatever trials awaited it. The rustlers had made a crucial mistake in targeting Eleanor's absence as a sign of weakness. They would soon discover that what she had built in Dustvale was stronger than any individual, more resilient than they could imagine, and defended by men who had finally found something worth dying for. The attack came at dawn, just as Thatch had predicted it would. The rustlers struck with military precision, emerging from the morning mist like vengeful spirits, intent on claiming territory they'd marked as their own. But they found Dustvale ready for them, defended by men who had discovered that some things were worth fighting for. Thatch crouched behind the reinforced fence line he'd spent the previous day strengthening, his father's rifle steady in his hands. The weapon was a fine piece of craftsmanship, passed down through generations of coalmen, who had understood that sometimes peaceful folks had to stand up to those who would take what didn't belong to them. Today, it would serve that purpose once again. Sheriff Brooks had positioned his men strategically around the approaches to the ranch, turning Eleanor's outdoor classroom into a fortress of determination and community resolve. The cottonwood trees that had sheltered children's laughter now provided cover for men prepared to die rather than surrender their future to organized theft and intimidation. "There," whispered Miller, pointing toward the eastern ridge where movement in the brush betrayed the rustlers' approach. "Looks like they're trying to flank us from two directions." Thatch nodded, his eyes tracking the subtle signs of approaching danger. These men moved like soldiers, with discipline and coordination that spoke of someone with military experience leading them. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated the resolve of people fighting to protect their homes and families. The first shots came from the rustlers' position on the ridge, bullets whistling through the morning air with deadly intent. But the defenders were ready, their response immediate and coordinated. Thatcher's rifle spoke with authority, sending one of the attackers spinning backward into the brush. "Hold your positions," Sheriff Brooks called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "Let them come to us." The strategy was sound. The rustlers had numbers and mobility, but the defenders held the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain. More importantly, they were fighting for something they couldn't afford to lose, the future Eleanor had helped them envision for their community. As the battle intensified, Thatch found himself thinking not of Sarah or past losses, but of Eleanor's promise to return and the life they planned to build together. Every shot he fired was a defense of that future. Every moment of danger survived was a step closer to the reunion he'd been dreaming of since she'd left for Boston. The rustlers' leader revealed himself during a lull in the fighting, standing boldly on the ridge with his rifle raised in defiance. He was a hard-faced man, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and his voice carried clearly across the distance, separating the two forces. "You're fighting for nothing," he shouted. "This territory belongs to us now. Surrender, and we'll let you live to find somewhere else to scratch out your pathetic existence." Thatch stood slowly, making himself visible above the fence line. His response came not as words, but as action, a carefully aimed shot that knocked the rustler leader's hat from his head, sending a clear message about Dustvale's intentions. "I reckon that's our answer," Sheriff Brooks called out, and the defenders' laughter rippled across their positions like a battle cry. The rustlers' response was immediate and vicious. They charged from multiple directions, their leader's tactical discipline evident in the coordinated assault. But they encountered defenders who had been forged into a unified force by months of shared purpose and mutual respect. Miller and his sons held the southern approach with the kind of stubborn determination that came from defending land they'd worked with their own hands. The Morrison family, despite having lost their barn to the rustlers just days before, fought with the fury of people who refused to be driven from their home. Even Doc Henley had taken up arms, his medical training serving him well as he provided covering fire while treating wounded defenders. Mrs. Whitmore had insisted on staying to load rifles and provide ammunition, her grey hair hidden beneath an old cavalry hat that had belonged to her late husband. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably no more than 30 minutes of intense fighting. Gradually, the rustlers' assault began to falter as they encountered resistance far fiercer than they had anticipated. These weren't frightened farmers to be easily intimidated. They were people defending everything that mattered to them. The turning point came when Sheriff Brooks spotted a group of riders approaching from the west. For a heart-stopping moment, everyone feared the rustlers had reinforcements arriving. But the riders bore the badge of the U.S. Marshal's office, drawn by reports of organized cattle theft and armed conflict. "Federal Marshals!" Sheriff Brooks shouted, his voice filled with relief and triumph. "Looks like our telegram got through." The rustlers' leader saw the approaching reinforcements and made the only sensible decision available to him. With a series of sharp whistle signals, he ordered his men to withdraw, abandoning their assault in favor of escape while they still could. As the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance, the defenders of Dustvale emerged from their positions, battered but victorious. They had protected their community, preserved their future, and proven that sometimes good people could prevail against overwhelming odds when they stood together. Thatcher looked toward the cottonwood trees where Eleanor's students would soon return to continue their education, and he smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had kept faith with the woman he loved and the future they were building together. 2 weeks after the battle that saved Dustvale, Eleanor stood in the oak-paneled study of her father's Boston mansion, facing the man who had shaped her early life and tried to control her destiny from afar. Charles Worthington looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by illness, but still radiating the forceful personality that had built a commercial empire from nothing. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of disappointment and frustrated authority, "you look rustic." She had chosen her clothes carefully for this confrontation. The simple blue dress she'd worn to teach her students, her hair arranged in the practical style she'd adopted in Dustvale, her hands showing the honest calluses of someone who worked for a living. She wanted him to see exactly who she had become, not who he expected her to be. "I look like myself, Father, perhaps for the first time in my life." The lawyers seated around the massive mahogany table stirred uncomfortably at the tension in the room. Eleanor recognized the type-expensive suits, calculating eyes, men who saw human relationships as contracts to be negotiated and enforced. Her father's attempt to invalidate her marriage to James had clearly been their idea. "Sit down, Eleanor. We have much to discuss." Charles gestured toward a chair that would place her in the position of a supplicant seeking favor. Instead, she remained standing, her posture reflecting the confidence she'd gained from years of managing classrooms and communities. "Actually, Father, I believe you have quite a lot of explaining to do, beginning with your attempt to have my marriage declared invalid, and ending with your threats to have me declared mentally incompetent for choosing to teach rather than socialize." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Miss Worthington, your father's concerns are entirely reasonable. A woman of your education and breeding, living in primitive conditions, working for practically nothing, it suggests a concerning inability to make rational decisions about your own welfare." Eleanor's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "Rational decisions? I chose to marry a man I loved rather than someone who could advance my social position. I chose to continue meaningful work rather than abandon a community that needed me. I chose to build a life based on purpose rather than privilege. If that's evidence of mental incompetence, then I plead guilty as charged." She walked to the window that looked out over Boston's fashionable Back Bay, thinking of how different this view was from the endless Texas sky she'd grown to love. But let me share something with you about rational decisions, Father. The life I've built in Dust Vale has given me more satisfaction and genuine happiness than all the years I spent in Boston society. I've watched children discover the joy of learning, helped families strengthen their bonds, found love with a man who values my character rather than my inheritance. Love? Charles's voice was sharp with disdain. You mean infatuation with some frontier farmer who sees you as his ticket to financial security? I mean love with a man who offered me shelter when I had nothing, who supported my work without asking for anything in return, who mourns his first wife with the same devotion he offers his second chance at happiness. Eleanor turned from the window to face her father directly. The kind of love you never understood, even with Mother. The reference to her deceased mother struck home, and Charles's face tightened with old pain. Your mother died because she insisted on involving herself in charity work in the worst parts of the city. Her good works exposed her to the disease that killed her. Mother died because she believed in using her advantages to help people who had fewer opportunities. She died doing exactly what gave her life meaning. Eleanor's voice softened with memory and resolve. Just as James died serving patients who needed medical care, just as I'm willing to risk your disapproval to continue teaching children who deserve an education. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small locket, the one that had contained James's photograph for 5 years. But now it held something new, a pressed flower from the cottonwood trees where she taught, and a small piece of fabric from the curtains she'd sewn from Sarah's materials. I'm not the frightened young woman who fled Boston 5 years ago, Father. I'm a teacher, a community builder, a woman who has found her calling and her heart in the most unlikely of places. She opened the locket, showing him the simple mementos that represented her chosen life. I replaced James's photograph not because I love him less, but because I've learned that the heart can hold both cherished memories and new hope. Charles stared at the locket, perhaps seeing for the first time the depth of his daughter's transformation. Eleanor, I'm dying. The doctors give me perhaps 6 months. If you don't take control of the business, if you don't assume your responsibilities as my heir, everything I've built will be lost. Then we'd better discuss how to arrange proper management for your companies, Eleanor replied calmly, because I'm returning to Texas regardless of your threats or inducements. But I'm not abandoning my responsibilities either. I'm simply fulfilling them in a way that honors both your legacy and my own convictions. She moved to the chair she'd refused earlier, but sat in it as an equal partner in negotiations rather than a wayward daughter seeking forgiveness. Now, gentlemen, let's discuss how to structure a trust that can manage Father's business interests while allowing me to continue the work that gives my life meaning. I believe we can find a solution that serves everyone's best interests, including the communities that will benefit from the educational foundations I intend to establish. The lawyers exchanged glances, recognizing that they were dealing with a woman who had learned to negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. Eleanor Worthington might have returned to Boston, but Eleanor Finch was clearly in charge of the conversation. 6 months later, as spring returned to the Texas plains and wildflowers painted the landscape in brilliant colors, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the newly completed Dust Vale schoolhouse, watching her students file in for the morning's lessons. The building had been constructed with funds from the Worthington Educational Foundation, known of several charitable trusts she'd established, using her inheritance to support frontier communities throughout the West. The new schoolhouse was everything the old one had been, and more spacious classrooms with large windows to let in natural light, a library filled with books that would challenge minds at every level, and a bell tower that sang out each morning to call children to learning. But Eleanor treasured the outdoor classroom under the cottonwood trees just as much, understanding that the best education happened when young minds could connect with the natural world around them. "Mrs. Cole," called Mary Hendricks, now 7 years old and reading at a level that would have challenged children twice her age. "Will you tell us about the wedding again? About how you and Mr. Thatcher almost got married during the battle?" Eleanor laughed, settling into the chair beside her desk, the same desk where she'd once spread Sarah's fabric to sew curtains. but which now held lesson plans that would challenge and inspire her growing student body. That's not quite how it happened, Mary, but I suppose it makes for a more exciting story. The truth was both simpler and more profound than Mary's romantic imagination suggested. Eleanor had returned from Boston 6 weeks after her departure, having secured her father's business affairs and established the foundation that would fund educational initiatives throughout the frontier. She'd found Dustvale scarred but victorious, its people bound together by the shared experience of defending their community against those who would have destroyed it. Thatch had been waiting for her at the stagecoach stop, his face showing the strain of battle and separation, but his eyes bright with the joy of reunion. They'd married 3 days later, in a ceremony that brought together everyone who had fought to preserve their future families, gathered under the cottonwood trees where Eleanor had first taught their children. Vows spoken in the presence of people who understood that love was something you fought for, not something you simply fell into. The important thing, Eleanor told her students, is that sometimes the best adventures come from choosing to stay and build something meaningful rather than running away when things get difficult. Mr. Thatch and I both learned that lesson. Sam Hendricks, now 14 and preparing for advanced studies that would take him to college in Austin, raised his hand. "Mrs. Cole, are you ever sorry you didn't stay in Boston? My ma says you could have lived like a queen if you'd wanted to." Eleanor considered the question seriously, looking around at faces that had become as dear to her as family. Through the window, she could see Thatch working with a group of older boys on a carpentry project that would add workshop space to the school. His hands moved with the same careful skill she'd first admired when he'd repaired fence posts, but now those hands also held her close each night and helped her tend the garden they'd planted, where his house had once stood empty and lonely. "Sam, I've learned something important about being rich," she said finally. "Real wealth isn't about money in the bank or fine clothes or big houses. It's about having work that matters, people who love you for who you really are, and the chance to make a difference in the world around you. By that measure, I'm the richest woman in Texas." The children giggled at her answer, but Eleanor saw understanding in their young faces. These were children who were growing up with different expectations than she'd had. They believed that education and hard work could take them anywhere they wanted to go, that their dreams were limited only by their willingness to pursue them. After school, Eleanor walked home to the house that had finally become what Sarah had envisioned, a place filled with warmth and laughter, conversation and love. The curtains she'd sewn from Sarah's fabric still hung in the windows, but they were joined now by other touches that reflected the blended life she and Thatch had created together. Books lined the shelves Sarah had planned for children's toys, and the dining room table was large enough to accommodate the frequent guests who had become part of their extended family. In the kitchen, she found Thatch preparing dinner with the same methodical care he brought to everything he undertook. He looked up as she entered, his smile carrying the easy contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. "How were the scholars today?" he asked, pulling her close for the kind of kiss that still made her heart skip after all these months of marriage. "Eager as always. Mary wants to be a teacher when she grows up, and Sam is already talking about studying law so he can help frontier communities like ours. Sounds like you're building quite a legacy, Mrs. Cole." Eleanor settled into his arms, thinking of the children who would grow up with opportunities their parents had never imagined, of the communities throughout the West that would benefit from the educational foundations she'd established, of the love that had grown strong enough to honor the past while embracing the future. "We're building a legacy," she corrected gently. "All of us together, you, me, the families who trusted us with their children's future, the community that refused to give up when times got hard." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started as a homeless teacher with nothing but her dignity and a trunk full of books. She'd become a wife, a community leader, and the founder of educational initiatives that would outlast her own lifetime. But most importantly, She'd learned that home wasn't something you were born to or bought with money. It was something you built with love, patience, and the courage to keep trying, even when the future seemed uncertain. In Thatcher's gentle strength and the children's eager voices, in the sound of the school bell calling young minds to discovery, and the comfort of evening conversations with the man she'd chosen to share her life, Eleanor had found the kind of wealth that could never be taken away. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the person who understood her heart. And that, she knew, was worth more than all the gold in Boston's banks.